September 23, 1900. Madison Avenue, New York City. The hour before dawn when fortunes are stolen and empires crumble in silence. A fine, persistent rain has been falling for hours, transforming the cobblestones into dark glass that reflects the dying glow of gas lamps, struggling against the harsh, electric glare of the new century. The Berkeley Hotel stands with quiet, patrician confidence at the corner of Madison Avenue, its windows dark except for one, a single, faintly lit rectangle on the 5th floor that holds within it the final moments of one of America's greatest dynasties. Inside Suite 500, the night is ending for William Marsh Rice in a way no one will ever call natural. The room breathes with the heavy opulence of the Gilded Age, thick velvet curtains drawn against the Manhattan darkness, ornate Victorian furniture polished to a somber sheen, Persian rugs that swallow footsteps, and an oil portrait above the mantel, Rice himself in younger years, stern-eyed and unsmiling, watching over his older self with judicial calm. This is a sanctuary designed for a man who believed wealth could purchase immunity from the chaos of the world. On the great bed, beneath layers of silk and linen that cost more than most Americans earned in a year, lies William Marsh Rice. 84 years old. Cotton magnate. Railroad baron. Architect of a $7 million dynasty. One of the 5 wealthiest men in the United States. His thin, blue-veined hand has fallen from the sheets and hangs limp over the edge, fingers slightly curled as if they had tried one last time to grasp the world he spent a lifetime conquering. His mouth is parted, but no breath escapes. His face, once tightly controlled in life, is slack in death, the stern merchant's lines erased. His skin has taken on a color that does not belong to the living, a faint, unsettling gray that no amount of gaslight can warm. But there is something in this room that should not be there. Not the ordinary scent of age and sleep, not the trace of coal smoke that slips through the curtains, not the faint cologne lingering on expensive linen. It is sweeter than that, almost cloying, a chemical sweetness that sits heavily in the air above the bed like an invisible accusation. Chloroform. The word will not appear on the death certificate his enemies intend to arrange for him, but the truth is irreducible, hanging in the stagnant air like a confession. Beside the pillow, on sheets that once knew only the weight of an old man's dreams, lies a white cloth, irregularly folded, stained and damp with the substance that has just ended a life. This cloth is the last object that touched William Marsh Rice's face, the instrument of a murder so intimate, so calculated, that it makes a mockery of every fortress he built around his fortune. Standing in the doorway, framed by the dim light from the hallway, is Charles Frederick Jones. Rice's trusted valet. His butler, the man who has served him faithfully for years, who knew his routines better than Rice knew them himself, who mixed his medicine and brought his meals and slept in the adjacent room to be available at a moment's notice. Jones does not look like a villain from the cautionary tales of the era, no lurid eyes or theatrical cruelty. He looks exactly as he has been trained to look, neat, unremarkable, deferential. The perfect servant whose very existence depends on never drawing attention to himself. Now, he is something else entirely. He watches his employer with an expression of calculated composure, his face betraying neither panic nor remorse, only the careful attention of a man monitoring the success of a meticulously planned operation. His hands are steady, his breathing is controlled. He has crossed a threshold from which there can be no return, and he accepts it with the cold pragmatism of someone who has weighed the consequences and decided the prize was worth the damnation. This was not a crime of passion or sudden rage. This was premeditated murder executed with the precision of a business transaction, a conspiracy months in the making involving forged documents, fraudulent telegrams, and carefully administered doses of mercury designed to weaken the old man's constitution without raising suspicion. Jones had been poisoning Rice slowly, methodically, preparing him for this final night when the chloroform would finish what the mercury had begun. And Rice, trusting in the natural order of things, trusting in the hierarchy that placed servants beneath suspicion, had never questioned why his health had declined so rapidly. Within hours, Jones will summon the doctor with practiced grief in his voice, announcing that Mr. Rice appeared to have passed peacefully in his sleep. Within days, he will produce documents, a will that redirects the bulk of Rice's fortune away from its intended destination and into the hands of his conspirator Albert Patrick, the charming New York lawyer who promised Jones wealth beyond imagination in exchange for this single act of ultimate betrayal. Within weeks, the most scandalous murder trial of the Gilded Age will grip a nation, exposing the dark machinery of greed that operated in the shadows of America's greatest fortunes. Here lies the terrible irony that haunts every gilded fortress, every carefully constructed empire built on the assumption that wealth provides protection from the chaos of the world. William Marsh Rice had spent 40 years building an empire designed to outlive him, fortified against every conceivable threat his calculating mind could imagine. He had survived economic panics that destroyed lesser men, navigated the treacherous politics of Reconstruction-era Texas, defended himself against lawsuits from grasping relatives, and structured his affairs with such meticulous precision that even death, he believed, could not dismantle what he had created. He fortified himself against hostile markets and fickle politicians, against storms that might destroy his cotton warehouses, against the countless small bankruptcies that consumed lesser men. The bank vaults and law offices of 2 states quietly testified to his caution, to his obsession with control. His name had become less that of a man than of an institution, a dynasty carved from the humid wilderness of early Texas and solidified through ruthless negotiation in the boardrooms of the Gilded Age. Yet he never imagined the danger sleeping just down the hall, the man who held his keys and knew his schedule and mixed his medicine and possessed the most dangerous weapon of all, his complete and utter trust. Rice had fortified his empire against external threats, but he had left the gates open for the enemy within, the predator who wore the mask of loyalty and service while calculating the exact moment to strike. He forgot that the servant sees the master when the master is naked, when he is asleep, when he is weak. He forgot that the person who prepares your food and guards your sleep holds a power over you that no amount of money can buy off. The Gilded Age was an era defined by the separation of classes, by the belief that money created a separate species of human, untouchable by the common vulgarities of the world. Rice had constructed his life around this principle, insulating himself in this hotel suite, believing he had shut the world out. But he had locked the danger inside with him. He had placed his life in the hands of a man he viewed as a utility, a piece of furniture that breathed, never realizing that behind those deferential eyes burned the ambition to possess everything his master had built. Outside, the rain continues its relentless assault on the windows, washing the streets clean while leaving the sins of Suite 500 untouched. The first delivery wagons are beginning to clatter over the cobblestones, bringing milk and ice to the city's elite. The world is waking up, completely unaware that one of its titans has been extinguished, that a conspiracy of staggering magnitude has just reached its bloody conclusion in the shadows of respectability. The sheer audacity of the theft happening in this room is breathtaking. It is not just a life being stolen. It is a legacy. The William Marsh Rice Institute, a university meant to be a gift to the future, a temple of science and art that would bear his name for eternity, hangs in the balance. The millions intended to educate generations of students are being diverted into the pockets of a crooked lawyer and a murderous valet, transforming a dream of intellectual immortality into a nightmare of greed and betrayal. But this perfect crime will prove to be imperfectly executed. The conspirators have underestimated one crucial element: the doctor who will refuse to sign the death certificate, the physician whose trained nose will detect what Jones has tried to conceal, whose suspicion will unravel the entire conspiracy and expose the machinery of murder that operated in the shadows of one of America's greatest fortunes. To understand how one of America's most calculating men fell victim to his own valet, how a dynasty built on cotton and railroads nearly became the prize of murderers, and how a university designed to educate generations almost never opened its doors, we must leave this room and its chemical, scented air of betrayal. We must go back to the swamps of early Houston where Rice first made his fortune, back to the careful accumulation of wealth that transformed a Massachusetts merchant into a Texas titan, back to the obsessive planning that created his vision of educational immortality, and back to the moment when Rice made the fatal decision to trust the wrong people with access to his sanctuary. Because this story is not simply about murder, it is about the illusion of control, the vulnerability hidden beneath every fortune, and the terrible price of misplaced trust in an age when wealth was worshipped as the ultimate protection against mortality itself. William Marsh Rice was not born into a dynasty. He carved one from the humid wilderness of early Texas, understanding that in the chaos of the frontier, cotton was king, and he would be its undisputed architect. His story embodies the quintessential paradox of the Gilded Age, a man who built an impregnable fortress of wealth, yet remained fatally vulnerable to those he trusted most. To comprehend the magnitude of his betrayal, one must first understand the extraordinary life that preceded it, a life defined by calculation so precise it bordered on the supernatural, yet blind to the human treachery that would ultimately destroy him. Born in 1816 in Springfield, Massachusetts, William Marsh Rice entered a world of modest prosperity and Puritan restraint, where fortunes were measured in acres rather than empires. His family possessed neither aristocratic lineage nor inherited wealth, only the stern New England virtues of thrift, discipline, and an almost religious devotion to the accumulation of capital. Young William absorbed these lessons with the intensity of a convert, understanding from his earliest years that money was not merely a tool for comfort, but a weapon against the chaos and indignity of poverty. He possessed what can only be called a merchant's gaze, an instinctive way of looking at the world and seeing not just what it was, but what it could be sold for. His formal education ended early, not in the manicured quads of Harvard or Yale, but at the counter of a small store, handling inventory, observing customers, noting who paid on time and who did not. While other boys memorized Latin declensions, Rice memorized profit margins. He watched the slow circulation of goods along the eastern seaboard and understood that the great fortunes of the 19th century would not be made by those who waited for opportunity to arrive, but by those willing to chase it into the unsteady territories of risk. By age 22, when most men of his station might have settled into their father's trades, Rice turned his calculating gaze southward, toward a place few of his Massachusetts neighbors could even imagine, the Republic of Texas. In 1838, Rice arrived in Houston carrying modest capital and immodest ambitions. The city that would become his empire was then little more than a swamp with pretensions, a collection of rough wooden structures sinking into mud, populated by opportunists, refugees, and men running from debts or crimes in more civilized places. Yellow fever swept through with seasonal regularity. The summers were suffocating, and the humidity felt like drowning in warm water. The muddy streets disappeared beneath the rains, clouds of mosquitoes rose from stagnant water, and the very air seemed to resist human habitation. Where others saw squalor, Rice saw margins. Where others saw the discomfort of distance, he saw the power of being first. Rice began with the fundamental building block of frontier commerce, a general store selling necessities to settlers and speculators. Barrels of flour and molasses, tools, cloth, basic implements for a population still trying to transform wilderness into town. But he treated even this modest venture as the first brick in an elaborate edifice, watching every transaction with the intensity of a scientist studying specimens. He identified which goods moved fastest, which prices the market would bear, who habitually required credit but eventually paid, and who was quietly gliding toward insolvency. Most crucially, he recognized that the real money lay not in retail, but in the white gold beginning to appear with greater regularity along the Gulf Coast. Cotton. Cotton was the raw material feeding the industrial mills of Britain and New England, and Texas soil grew it in staggering abundance. Rice understood that the real power lay not in the plantation house, but in the office where prices were set and contracts signed. He became not a grower, but a broker, an intermediary between those who worked the fields and the distant markets that transformed their crop into vast profits. He extended credit to planters, purchased their crops, arranged shipping, and took his percentage at every stage of the transaction. It was a business model that required capital, nerve, and the ability to read men's characters as accurately as ledger books. Rice possessed all three in abundance. By the time the Civil War erupted in 1861, threatening to tear the nation apart, Rice controlled much of Houston's cotton trade. The war should have destroyed him. Cotton exports collapsed under the Union blockade, Confederate currency became worthless paper, and the entire Southern economy imploded into ruin. Yet Rice emerged from the war wealthier than when it began, having demonstrated the quality that would define his entire career, an almost supernatural ability to preserve capital during catastrophe. His true genius was not in growing wealth, but in protecting it. He had diversified obsessively, converting cotton profits into railroads, understanding that the man who owned the tracks owned the commerce they carried. He invested in lumber mills, banks, and vast tracts of real estate, each investment calculated with mathematical precision, each risk measured against potential ruin. Rice's personal life was conducted with the same calculating precision that governed his business affairs. His marriages were strategic alliances rather than romantic unions, mergers of capital and social standing that benefited all parties involved. In 1850, he married Margaret Bremond, daughter of one of Houston's most prominent families, a union that cemented his position in the city's emerging aristocracy. Margaret brought connections to the old Texan families who controlled politics and land grants. Rice brought wealth and the promise of more to come. After her death in 1863, he married Julia Elizabeth Baldwin Brown, a wealthy widow whose assets merged with his own, further fortifying his financial position. These calculated relationships served their purpose in establishing his social credentials, yet they left Rice without natural heirs, a void that would prove fatally significant. Despite 2 marriages, he remained childless. There were no sons to inherit the railroads, no daughters to marry into other dynasties, no grandchildren to give his accumulated wealth a human purpose. This absence created a dangerous vacuum at the center of his vast fortune, a silence in the great halls of his estate that would eventually attract predators. By 1896, Rice was worth an estimated $7 million, equivalent to more than $200 million in modern currency. He had reached the pinnacle of Gilded Age success, controlling banks, railroads, real estate across Texas and Louisiana, timber operations, and cotton warehouses. Yet as he entered the twilight of his life, the question of legacy began to consume him. He became obsessed with a singular vision, the William Marsh Rice Institute for the Advancement of Literature, Science, and Art, a university in Houston that would bear his name for eternity, transforming his accumulated wealth into intellectual immortality. It would be his masterpiece, the culmination of everything he had worked for, his answer to mortality itself. Rice threw himself into planning the institute with the same obsessive attention to detail that had built his commercial empire. He consulted with architects, drafted bylaws, established an endowment structure designed to fund the university in perpetuity. Every aspect was calculated, every contingency anticipated, every threat neutralized through careful legal architecture. The institute would be his perfect creation, his final victory over the chaos that had threatened him throughout his life. But empires built on meticulous control attract those who wish to seize them. Fortunes without obvious heirs draw predators the way corpses draw vultures. And in the twilight of his life, increasingly isolated in New York, embroiled in bitter litigation over his late wife's estate, dependent on a shrinking circle of advisors, Rice made a decision that would plant the seeds of his destruction. He placed his trust in a charming New York lawyer named Albert Patrick, a man who saw in the aging magnate not a human being but a vault waiting to be cracked, and who possessed the ambition and moral vacancy necessary to transform that vision into murder. Albert Thomas Patrick was everything William Marsh Rice was not: charming where Rice was austere, reckless where Rice was calculated, and desperately ambitious where Rice was methodically patient. If the Gilded Age produced titans of industry like Rice, it also spawned a darker corollary: the predators who lived in their shadows, feeding on the scraps of immense fortunes until they developed an appetite for the whole feast. Patrick possessed the particular brand of charisma that the era produced in abundance: men who could speak the language of respectability while harboring the instincts of highwaymen. Lawyers who understood that the greatest thefts were committed not with guns, but with forged signatures and fraudulent documents. When he first encountered the aging Texas magnate, Patrick saw not a human being with a history and a soul, but a decaying vault waiting to be cracked, a problem of geometry and leverage rather than morality. Patrick had not been born into privilege, but had clawed his way through the harsh ranks of New York's legal establishment, operating in those gray zones where the law became elastic and morality negotiable. By 1900, he was 35 years old, educated, impeccably dressed, and drowning in debts that his legal practice could never hope to satisfy. He possessed expensive tastes and even more expensive gambling habits, the quiet vices that bleed a man's finances without leaving obvious scars. His nights were spent in the discreet gaming houses that catered to Manhattan's professional class, where fortunes changed hands across green felt tables and men learned to smile while their lives crumbled beneath them. Patrick's legal income could not sustain the life he believed he deserved, but he possessed something more valuable than money: access to the inner sanctum of one of America's greatest fortunes. Initially, Rice had hired Patrick to handle what appeared to be routine legal affairs in New York, managing properties, drafting contracts, navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the city's real estate market. Rice, increasingly consumed by bitter litigation over his late wife's estate, needed someone to manage his Manhattan affairs while he battled relatives in Texas courts over millions in contested inheritance. Patrick positioned himself as indispensable, the smooth-talking intermediary who could handle the mundane complexities, while Rice focused on larger battles. But Patrick possessed something far more dangerous than legal competence: access to Rice's trust and financial documents, to the full architecture of the old man's carefully constructed empire. By 1900, William Marsh Rice had become a king in exile, spending most of his time in New York, estranged from his Texas roots and physically isolated in the claustrophobic luxury of the Berkeley Hotel. The vibrant social circle of his youth had vanished, replaced by a silence broken only by the scratching of pens and the murmuring of lawyers. He was embroiled in exhausting legal warfare over his wife Julia's estate, a battle that left him paranoid, drained, and dependent on an increasingly small circle of advisors who controlled his access to the outside world. The litigation had become a consuming obsession, and Patrick counseled delay at every turn, insisting that leaving New York would compromise Rice's legal position. In reality, Patrick was ensuring that Rice remained isolated, cut off from the Houston lawyers who might have protected him, trapped in a city where Patrick controlled the flow of information and influence. Rice had spent a lifetime building walls to keep the world out, but in his final years, those walls had turned into a prison. His days had condensed into predictable routines: breakfast at a fixed hour, limited walks, early evenings, and a growing reliance on medication to soothe the aches of age. His world had narrowed to the confines of his suite and the small group of men who managed his affairs, and at the center of this shrinking world stood Charles Frederick Jones. Jones was the perfect servant for a man who valued discretion above all else. Rice's valet, butler, nurse, and gatekeeper rolled into one unremarkable figure. He possessed a talent for invisibility that made him invaluable in a society obsessed with hierarchy and appearances. Jones was a man so nondescript that visitors often forgot his face within minutes of leaving the suite, blending into the heavy velvet curtains and mahogany furniture until he became less a person than a function. He had served Rice faithfully for years, managing the intricate details of his household, administering his daily medications, carrying his correspondence, and sleeping in the adjacent room to be available at a moment's notice. He knew Rice's routines with intimate precision: when he woke, what he ate, when he was most vulnerable. Rice trusted Jones implicitly because the entire social architecture of the Gilded Age was built on such trust. The wealthy did not question their servants any more than they questioned the furniture. After all, what threat could a servant possibly pose to a man who controlled railroads and banks, who had survived economic panics and legal wars? The idea that Jones might harbor ambitions beyond his station would have struck Rice as absurd, a violation of the natural order as fundamental as gravity reversing itself. Jones was a tool, an extension of Rice's own will, incapable of independent agency. It was this very arrogance that Albert Patrick exploited with surgical precision. He recognized what Rice did not, that Jones was not a piece of furniture, but a man with resentments, desires, and a deep, festering knowledge of his master's vulnerabilities. In early 1900, Patrick began to cultivate the valet, transforming their professional acquaintance into something far more dangerous. Their first conversations were innocuous: matters of schedule, messages to be passed, arrangements to be made. But gradually, Patrick probed deeper, searching for the soft points in Jones's loyalties, painting a picture of a future where the servant was no longer answering bells and emptying chamber pots, but living as a gentleman of leisure. Patrick and Jones began meeting in clandestine corners of Manhattan, dim restaurants where no one would recognize them, shadowy doorways, perhaps even late-night murmurs in the hotel itself. The lawyer slowly drew the valet into a web from which there would be no escape, preying on Jones's fatigue, his boredom, and the quiet humiliation of a lifetime spent in service to a demanding, miserly old man. It was a seduction of the most dangerous kind, built on mutual contempt and mutual need. Patrick despised Jones as a social inferior, a necessary tool to be discarded once the fortune was secured. Jones despised Patrick as the embodiment of everything he had been trained to serve, but could never become. Yet both men understood that alone, neither could succeed. As their conspiracy deepened, Patrick revealed the fatal flaw he had discovered in Rice's meticulous estate planning. The old man's will left nearly everything to the Rice Institute. If Rice died naturally, his millions would flow into the educational endowment, leaving Patrick with modest legal fees and Jones with a pittance. For Patrick, drowning in gambling debts and expensive tastes, this was intolerable. The fortune was there, tangible and immense, locked away by pieces of paper that he, as a lawyer, knew how to manipulate. Patrick began drafting a new reality, one fraudulent document at a time. He started with small tests of the system, creating forged checks that bore Rice's distinctive signature. He and Jones spent hours in clandestine practice sessions, the valet learning to reproduce his master's elegant, tremulous handwriting on scrap paper. They perfected the loops and slants, turning the unique mark of a titan into a reproducible commodity. When the first forged checks cleared without raising alarm, it was a revelation. The great fortress was not impregnable. It was guarded by bored clerks and routine bureaucracy. Emboldened by these early successes, Patrick moved to the centerpiece of his scheme, a completely fraudulent will. This New Testament was a masterpiece of legal fiction that rewrote Rice's entire legacy, sidelining the Institute and naming Albert Patrick as the primary beneficiary of the $7 million estate. To ensure Jones's loyalty and silence, the document included generous provisions for the valet, promising him hundreds of thousands of dollars, enough to transform him from invisible domestic to gentleman of leisure, enough to erase the indignity of a lifetime spent bowing and scraping. Throughout the summer of 1900, the Berkeley Hotel suite became a theater of deception, where every interaction was a performance. Jones carried out his duties with terrifying duality, fluffing pillows and pouring tea for the man he was planning to rob, smiling deferentially while his mind raced with the numbers Patrick had promised him. The apartment's very air seemed thick with conspiracy, heavy with the weight of unspoken betrayal. Patrick worked feverishly to create a paper trail of false correspondence, forging letters in which Rice expressed deep gratitude for his legal counsel, inventing a friendship that did not exist to justify an inheritance that was never intended. But the world outside their carefully controlled environment was beginning to intrude with increasing urgency. Rice's longtime attorneys in Houston, men who had known him for decades and understood his true intentions for the Institute, were growing suspicious of the strange telegrams and erratic communications emanating from New York. The old man's instructions seemed uncharacteristic, inconsistent with decades of careful financial management. Captain James Baker and other trusted Texas advisors began making inquiries, sending increasingly urgent messages demanding Rice's immediate return to Houston. They noticed the silence, the delays, the odd tone that didn't match the William Marsh Rice they had served for years. Patrick felt the walls closing in around him. He realized that time had become their greatest enemy. If Rice returned to Texas, he would be surrounded by loyalists, protected by the very institution he had founded. The forgeries would be exposed, the accounts audited, and the conspiracy revealed. The window of opportunity was shutting with terrifying speed. The slow game of waiting for nature to take its course was no longer viable. Nature was too slow, and the law was too fast. It was in this crucible of mounting pressure that the fatal decision crystallized. The conspiracy could no longer rely on fraud alone. The pen had done all it could. Now something more final was required. Patrick looked at the situation with the cold logic that had defined his entire legal career and realized there was only one solution that could guarantee success. Rice could not be allowed to return to Texas. He could not be allowed to answer those urgent telegrams. He could not be allowed to live long enough to discover the elaborate web of deception that had been woven around his fortune. Patrick provided Jones with chloroform, a chemical that would cause swift unconsciousness, followed by respiratory failure, a death that might be mistaken for heart failure in an elderly man if the examining physician was not too careful. The method was chillingly simple. Jones would saturate a cloth with the substance and hold it over Rice's face during sleep until his breathing stopped. It was murder reduced to its most basic mechanics, the final step in transforming an intricate web of fraud into something far more irrevocable. What Patrick and Jones didn't realize as they crossed this ultimate threshold was that their carefully constructed trap was already beginning to close around them. The Houston lawyers' suspicions were hardening into certainty, their investigations were intensifying, and the very isolation that had made Rice vulnerable was also making his sudden death inevitable suspicious. The conspiracy that had seemed so perfectly planned was about to collide with forces beyond their control, and the fortune they believed was within their grasp would prove to be the instrument of their destruction. Throughout the sweltering summer of 1900, Albert Patrick and Charles Jones executed their conspiracy with the precision of seasoned criminals, transforming the Berkeley Hotel's Suite 500 into a carefully calibrated theater of deception where reality was rewritten one document at a time. The apartment on Madison Avenue became saturated with more than the oppressive humidity of a New York heat wave. It held the heavier, invisible weight of betrayal, the chemical whispers of a crime not yet committed, but already inevitable. Every interaction became a performance. Every gesture carried a double meaning, and the elegant suite contracted around William Marsh Rice like a spider's web tightening around prey that had long since stopped struggling. The old man moved through his final months in a fog of manipulated reality, unaware that every meal was potentially poisoned, every signature was potentially forged, and the two men he trusted most were methodically dismantling the empire he had spent a lifetime constructing. The systematic theft began as a testing of the waters, small calculated experiments designed to probe the boundaries of what they could accomplish without detection. This was the era of the gentleman criminal, where the most devastating weapons were not revolvers, but checkbooks, where fortunes could be stolen with nothing more than the quiet scratch of a pen. Jones, granted unfettered access to Rice's personal financial instruments, began the terrifying practice of forging his employer's distinctive signature, that elegant, slightly tremulous script that had signed contracts worth millions, that had built railroads and endowed universities, now reduced to a pattern that could be reproduced by criminal hands. Night after night, Jones practiced in the privacy of his room, hunched over scrap paper, filling sheets with approximations of Rice's handwriting until his hand could reproduce the peculiar loops and angles with mechanical accuracy. It was a performance of the most intimate betrayal. To steal a man's name is to steal a piece of his identity, to transform the sacred mark of a self-made titan into a reproducible commodity. The first forged checks were modest tests of the system, $500 here, $1,000 there, always made payable to Albert Patrick for fabricated legal services that Rice, in his increasingly confused state, might plausibly have authorized. When these initial fraudulent checks cleared the bank without a ripple of suspicion, the conspirators understood just how porous the great man's defenses truly were. Banks, intimidated by the name on the account and the reputation attached to it, did not scrutinize the handwriting with forensic precision. Clerks saw thousands of signatures daily. They looked for general authenticity, not the subtle tremors that might reveal deception. Rice, increasingly frail, his eyesight failing, and his mind clouded by the medications Jones was administering, never questioned the discrepancies in his accounts. His attention was consumed by the exhausting litigation over his wife's estate, and he had delegated financial minutiae to the very people who were robbing him. Each successfully cashed check emboldened the conspirators, proving that the great fortress of wealth was defended not by impenetrable walls, but by routine bureaucracy and assumptions of legitimacy. Patrick deposited the forged checks with casual confidence, his ambitions swelling with each successful transaction, but he understood that simple theft could never satisfy his desperate need for permanent wealth. He knew that Rice's death was inevitable, and with it, the cessation of legal fees and stolen checks. To secure a fortune that would last a lifetime, he needed to rewrite the future itself. Simultaneously with the check fraud, Patrick began drafting the centerpiece of his criminal enterprise, completely fraudulent testamentary documents that would redirect the bulk of Rice's $7 million estate away from the Rice Institute and into his own pockets. This new will was a masterpiece of cold-blooded legal fiction, crafted with the sophisticated language Patrick had mastered in New York's courts. The document painted a portrait of a deep, secret friendship between the reclusive magnate and his lawyer, a bond that supposedly superseded Rice's lifelong dedication to his educational legacy. It rewrote Rice's entire character, transforming the calculating merchant who had spent decades planning his university into a man of sudden, inexplicable generosity toward his legal counsel. To ensure Jones's unwavering complicity, the fraudulent will included generous provisions for the valet, hundreds of thousands of dollars that would transform the invisible servant into a gentleman of independent means, erasing forever the indignity of a lifetime spent bowing and scraping. The signatures on these fraudulent documents were forged with practiced precision, the product of Jones's months of nocturnal rehearsal. Patrick recruited witnesses through bribery and deception, men of loose principles and flexible memory who were paid in cash to swear they had seen Rice sign papers he had never touched. The document was backdated to appear as though Rice had signed it months earlier, during a period when his mental faculties could not easily be questioned. Patrick even manufactured a paper trail of correspondence supposedly showing Rice's growing dissatisfaction with the Institute's trustees and his deepening gratitude toward Patrick's legal guidance. Every element of the conspiracy was falling into place with mechanical efficiency. All that remained was the most crucial component, ensuring that William Marsh Rice died before anyone could challenge the document's authenticity, before the old man could wake from his manipulated fog and realize he had been systematically robbed, that the world outside their carefully controlled environment was refusing to cooperate with their timeline, and external forces were beginning to intrude with increasing urgency. Rice's longtime attorneys in Houston, Captain James Baker and others who had served him for decades, were demanding his immediate return to Texas with growing alarm. These were the guardians of the original vision, the men who had helped Rice build his empire, and they sensed a disturbance in the natural order of things. Telegrams arrived daily at the Berkeley Hotel, their tone progressing from polite inquiry to barely concealed panic. The Houston lawyers had detected something fundamentally wrong in the pattern of communications emanating from New York, some subtle wrongness in the instructions supposedly coming from Rice himself that didn't match the calculating merchant they had known for 40 years. The messages from Texas became increasingly urgent, demanding Rice's immediate return to oversee his affairs personally. Strange telegrams had been arriving in Houston, messages that didn't sound like Rice, requests for funds that made no business sense, and a peculiar silence regarding the institute that had been his consuming passion. Baker and his associates were suspicious, and their suspicion was a dangerous thing. They began making discreet inquiries, contacting New York banks, requesting account statements, asking questions that threatened to expose the entire conspiracy. Rice, confused by the conflicting advice of his trusted lawyer in New York and his old friends in Texas, wavered between competing loyalties. Patrick, sensing the mortal danger, worked feverishly to manipulate the old man, whispering poison in his ear, insisting that the Texas lawyers were plotting against him, that the journey would be too arduous for his declining health, that his only safety lay in remaining in New York, and remaining. Isolated, but each delay only intensified the Houston lawyers' suspicions, their investigations tightening around the conspiracy like a noose. Patrick could feel time becoming his greatest enemy, could sense that his window of opportunity was closing with terrifying speed. The pressure mounted throughout late August and early September with the relentless force of an approaching storm. Patrick's gambling debts were accelerating faster than his forged checks could cover them. Jones was growing visibly nervous, his hands shaking as he performed his daily duties, the weight of conspiracy pressing down on him with increasing psychological force. And Rice, despite his age and manipulation, was showing disturbing signs of wanting to return to Texas, talking with growing frequency about seeing his institute, about settling his affairs in Houston. If he boarded a train to Texas, if he escaped the controlled environment of the Berkeley Hotel and entered the protective circle of his longtime advisors, the entire conspiracy would collapse within hours. It was in this crucible of mounting desperation that Patrick made the decision that would transform fraud into something far more irrevocable. In early September, during one of their clandestine meetings in the shadows of Manhattan, Patrick approached Jones with a proposal that crossed the ultimate threshold from theft into homicide. The logic was seductive in its cold simplicity. They could no longer wait for nature to take its course. Rice was 84 years old, frail, increasingly dependent on medications that Jones administered daily. Who would question an elderly man dying peacefully in his sleep? The death would appear natural, heart failure perhaps or stroke, and with Patrick's legal expertise and Jones's intimate knowledge of Rice's routines, they could ensure the death certificate was signed without suspicion. For the instrument of this final transformation, Patrick selected chloroform, a substance that occupied the gray area between medicine and poison, a sweet-smelling chemical commonly used in medical procedures, but deadly in concentrated doses. Patrick explained the physiology of murder with clinical detachment, as though he were describing a legal procedure rather than planning the extinction of a human life. The chloroform would depress the central nervous system, causing swift unconsciousness, followed by respiratory failure. The heart, already weakened by age and the mercury pills Jones had been secretly administering, would simply stop beating. To the untrained eye, and even to a doctor expecting natural death, it would appear as cardiac arrest, utterly unremarkable in a man of Rice's advanced age. The method possessed a chilling simplicity that appealed to both conspirators' need for control and concealment. Jones would wait until Rice was deeply asleep, then saturate a cloth with chloroform and hold it firmly over the old man's nose and mouth. The victim would wake briefly, perhaps struggle weakly, but the chemical would quickly overcome any resistance. Within minutes, Rice's breathing would slow, then stop entirely. The death would be swift, relatively painless, and most importantly, undetectable if the examining physician was not actively looking for foul play. The attending physician would arrive, examine the body, note the advanced age and existing health conditions, and sign the death certificate attributing death to natural causes. But this plan required a level of intimacy that only a valet could provide, a betrayal so personal it defied the natural order of trust between master and servant. Jones would have to be the one to cross that final threshold, to stand over the man he had dressed and fed and protected for years, the man who trusted him to guard his sleep and extinguish his life with his own hands. Patrick provided the bottle and the instructions, but Jones would have to provide the nerve, the willingness to press that cloth down and hold it there until the struggling ceased forever. Throughout September, the apartment on Madison Avenue became saturated with a tension that bordered on the supernatural. Every ring of the doorbell felt like a hammer blow. Every delivery of a telegram carried the potential for exposure and ruin. The conspirators moved around Rice like ghosts, their eyes meeting in silent communication over the old man's head, sharing the terrible knowledge of what was coming. Jones performed his daily duties with mechanical precision, serving breakfast, managing correspondence, administering evening medications, all while knowing that one of these routine nights would be the last. Rice seemed to sense something wrong in the atmosphere, complaining of feeling watched, of strange dreams, of a heaviness in the air that he could not explain. But he attributed these sensations to age and illness, never imagining that the heaviness he felt was the weight of conspiracy closing around him like a coffin lid. Calendar pages flipped toward the fatal date with inexorable momentum, each passing day bringing new telegrams from Houston, new pressure from the lawyers who were slowly unraveling the conspiracy from 1,000 miles away. The timeline had shifted beyond Patrick's control. They could no longer afford to wait for the slow poisoning to take its natural course. The old man's constitution, forged in the hardships of the frontier, was proving more tenacious than anticipated, refusing to die on schedule. On the night of September 23rd, as fine rain began to fall on Madison Avenue and the city settled into the quiet hours before dawn, a final telegram arrived from Texas that could not be ignored or explained away. Plans were being made for Rice's immediate travel. The departure was imminent. The time for waiting was over. The machinery of murder had been constructed with meticulous precision, every gear calibrated, every contingency planned. Now it required only someone willing to set it in motion. Charles Jones entered William Marsh Rice's bedroom, carrying more than the usual evening medications and water glass. Hidden in his pocket was a small bottle of chloroform and a white cloth, the instruments of a murder so intimate, so calculated, that it made a mockery of every bond of trust and service. He carried the power to transform himself from invisible servant into millionaire, from nobody into somebody, from the man who answered bells to the man who would inherit millions. The room was quiet, the city outside was asleep, and the only sound was the rhythmic breathing of the old man, a rhythm that Jones knew he was about to stop forever, if he possessed the nerve to press that cloth over his employer's sleeping face and hold it there until the breathing ceased and the great William Marsh Rice became nothing more than a corpse whose fortune could finally be claimed. September 23, 1900. 3:47 in the morning, the hour when the city sleeps most deeply, when even the gas lamps seem to flicker with exhaustion, when the boundary between one day and the next dissolves into a liminal darkness where the impossible becomes inevitable. Charles Jones stood at the threshold between servant and murderer, the chloroform bottle heavy in his trembling hands, its glass surface slick with the nervous perspiration that betrayed his terror. He had rehearsed this moment for weeks in the quiet cruelty of his own imagination, reducing it to mechanics and timing, to the cold arithmetic of risk and reward. But now, in the suffocating darkness of the Berkeley Hotel's 5th floor, with the weight of actual murder pressing down upon him, his carefully constructed resolve began to fracture under the enormity of what he was about to do. The door to Rice's bedroom stood slightly ajar, as it always did, allowing Jones to monitor his employer's sleep and respond to any nocturnal needs. Through the narrow opening, he could see the faint outline of the great bed, the shape of William Marsh Rice beneath expensive linens, the slow rise and fall of the blankets, marking the rhythm of an old man's trusting sleep. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Jones remained frozen in the doorway, caught between the familiar indignity of service and the seductive promise of wealth that Albert Patrick had painted in such vivid colors. His hand tightened around the bottle, feeling the liquid shift inside like liquid damnation. He had come too far to retreat now. The conspiracy had acquired its own terrible momentum, carrying him forward like a man caught in a current too strong to resist. Rice slept peacefully in the darkness, his breathing slow and rhythmic, the deep, vulnerable sleep of a man who believed absolutely in the sanctity of his own sanctuary and the loyalty of those he had elevated to positions of trust. The gaslight from the hallway cast just enough pale illumination to reveal the old man's face, lined with 84 years of calculation and ambition, but now serene in unconsciousness. His white hair spread across the pillow like spun silver. His hands rested peacefully on his chest, and his mouth was slightly open as he drew breath after steady breath. He looked fragile in sleep, stripped of the stern merchant's authority that had commanded fortunes and built railroads, reduced to the universal vulnerability of advanced age and unconsciousness. This was the sleep of a man who had never imagined that the greatest danger to his life slept in the adjacent room. Jones entered with the careful, deliberate steps of a man crossing into damnation, each footfall placed with excruciating precision on the thick Persian carpet that swallowed sound. The room smelled as it always did at night, stale air, expensive cologne, the lingering trace of coal smoke that seeped through even the finest windows. He carried the white cloth in one hand and the bottle in the other, these simple household objects transformed into instruments of irrevocable transformation. His heart hammered against his ribs with such violence he half feared the sound would wake Rice before he could complete his terrible task, but the old man continued sleeping, oblivious to the approach of his own extinction. Jones unstopped the bottle, and immediately the sickly sweet smell of chloroform invaded the air, sharp and chemical, a scent that belonged to hospitals and surgical theaters, but was now being repurposed for murder. The fumes rose in invisible waves, making his eyes water and his head swim slightly as he saturated the cloth, feeling the liquid soak through the fabric and wet his fingers with its cold, oily presence. The smell was overpowering, nauseating, carrying with it the promise of swift, suffocating oblivion. He knew he had to move quickly now. Chloroform evaporated rapidly, and hesitation would only weaken his resolve. He approached the bed with the cloth heavy in his trembling hands, looking down at the man who had fed him, housed him, trusted him with the intimate details of daily existence. Rice lay on his back, mouth slightly open, his thin hair pushed back from his forehead, one hand resting on the blanket with the delicate fragility of advanced age. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, Jones stood over his employer, watching that gentle rise and fall of breath, knowing he was about to stop it forever. Then, without allowing himself time to think or reconsider, he lowered the chloroform-soaked cloth toward Rice's sleeping face. What followed lasted only minutes, but those minutes contained the terrible gravity of a lifetime, erasing 84 years of life, ambition, and carefully accumulated power in a cascade of chemical suffocation. Jones pressed the cloth firmly over Rice's mouth and nose, sealing the old man's airways with suffocating precision. At first, there was no reaction. The chloroform-laden fumes slipped seamlessly into the pattern of sleep. Then, after a second or two that felt like hours, Rice's body recognized the intrusion with primitive alarm. The old man's eyes snapped open, wide with confusion and terror, his brain struggling to process the impossible reality of betrayal and murder in his own bedroom. His hands came up instinctively, weakly, pushing against the source of suffocation with strength that might once have been formidable, but was now reduced to the feeble resistance of extreme age. Jones felt those fingers against his wrists, the ghostly echo of hands that had once signed contracts worth millions and commanded the respect of titans, now clawing desperately for air, for life, for mercy that would not come. Rice tried to cry out, but the cloth pressed against his mouth transformed his scream into a muffled sound that died in the heavy curtains and thick carpets of the suite. His body thrashed beneath the blankets with diminishing force, his legs kicking weakly as his system fought against the chemical assault. In his eyes, Jones saw the terrible moment of recognition, the understanding that his trusted servant had become his executioner, that the conspiracy he had never suspected had finally revealed its ultimate purpose. It was betrayal, distilled to its purest, most intimate essence. But at 84, weakened by months of mercury poisoning and the accumulated frailties of age, against a younger man's determined strength and the chemical weapon pressed over his face, William Marsh Rice had no chance whatsoever. The chloroform did its terrible work with clinical efficiency, flooding his system, depressing his central nervous system, shutting down the mechanisms that had sustained life for more than 8 decades. His struggles became less coordinated, his movements slowing like a clockwork toy winding down. His hands, which had built empires and signed the documents creating his beloved institute, fell away from Jones's wrists and dropped to the bed. His breathing, which had been rapid and panicked beneath the cloth, became shallow and irregular, then stopped entirely. Jones held the cloth in place for several minutes longer, terrified that any premature removal might allow Rice to recover, to cry out, to expose the conspiracy that had consumed months of planning. He pressed down with all his weight, feeling the old man's face beneath the fabric, feeling the complete absence of breath, the absolute stillness that marked the irreversible transition from life to death. When he finally pulled the cloth away, his hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. Rice's face was slack, his eyes half open and unseeing, his mouth slightly agape in a permanent expression of betrayal and incomprehension. The skin had taken on that peculiar gray pallor that belongs only to corpses, and in the dim gaslight, the great William Marsh Rice looked like nothing more than a wax effigy of his former self. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness, more oppressive than the chemical fumes that still hung in the air like an invisible accusation. Jones waited in that terrible quiet, listening to his own ragged breathing and the thunderous pounding of his heart, half expecting Rice to suddenly gasp back to life like a character from a Gothic novel. But the body remained motionless, and gradually Jones understood that he had crossed the ultimate threshold. He was no longer merely a conspirator or a thief. He was a murderer, and the weight of that transformation settled over him with crushing finality. Moving with the mechanical precision of a man clinging to routine as a shield against horror, Jones began the grim work of staging a natural death. He arranged Rice's body with careful attention to detail, folding the hands across the chest in the peaceful attitude of eternal rest, tilting the head slightly to one side, as though the old man had simply turned in his sleep and never woken. He smoothed the blankets, removed any signs of struggle, and placed the chloroform-soaked cloth on the nightstand where it might be mistaken for a handkerchief. He checked the room obsessively for any evidence of violence, any indication that death had been anything other than the natural conclusion of an aged life. Then, satisfied that he had created a convincing tableau of peaceful expiration, Jones returned to his own room to endure the longest hours of his life. The wait until dawn was an agony of anticipation and terror. Jones lay in his bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, replaying the murder in his mind with obsessive, horrifying detail. Every creak of the building made him start. Every distant sound transformed into the footsteps of approaching police. He rehearsed the lines he would deliver, the shocked discovery, the immediate summoning of medical attention, the grief of a loyal servant who had lost his beloved employer. He would have to be perfect. Any false note, any hint of guilt or foreknowledge, and the entire conspiracy would collapse like a house of cards. At 8 o'clock in the morning, as the city outside began its daily awakening, Jones knocked on Rice's door with what he hoped sounded like routine punctuality, calling out a cheerful morning greeting that received no response. He waited an appropriate interval, then entered with a breakfast tray, allowing it to crash to the floor in a carefully choreographed performance of shock and horror. He rushed to the bedside, felt for a pulse he knew would not be there, and then summoned Dr. Walter Curry with practiced grief saturating his voice. "Doctor," he said, his words carefully chosen to suggest natural causes and peaceful rest, "Mr. Rice appears to have passed peacefully in his sleep." Dr. Curry arrived within the hour, expecting nothing more than a routine examination of an elderly man who had succumbed to the inevitable frailties of advanced age. Heart failure, perhaps, or stroke, utterly unremarkable in someone of Rice's years. He entered the suite with professional detachment, carrying his medical bag and the quiet authority of his profession, prepared to sign a death certificate, offer condolences to the grieving servant, and collect his modest fee. It should have been the simplest of medical formalities, the kind of examination he performed regularly in a city where the wealthy aged and died with predictable regularity. But the moment Dr. Curry leaned over the body to begin his examination, something stopped him cold. His trained nostrils detected an odor that should not have been present in a room where someone had died naturally, a sweet chemical scent that was unmistakable to anyone with medical training. Chloroform. The smell was faint now, mixed with the stale air of the closed room, but for a doctor familiar with its use in surgical procedures, it was as distinctive as a signature written in the air itself. Curry straightened abruptly, his expression shifting from routine professionalism to sharp, focused suspicion. He examined Rice's face more carefully now, noting subtle signs he might otherwise have missed, the slight discoloration around the nostrils, the faint chemical burns that chloroform could leave on delicate tissue, the peculiar pallor that spoke of suffocation rather than cardiac arrest. He pulled back the blankets and examined the body with new eyes, observing the positioning of the hands that seemed too deliberate, the scratches on the wrists that suggested struggle, the congested features that belonged to a man who had died fighting for breath. His gaze moved methodically around the room, taking inventory of objects with the precision of a man who understood that details told stories. Among the predictable items on the nightstand, a glass of water, a pocket watch, a handkerchief, sat a medicine bottle that Curry knew he had never prescribed. He lifted it, turning it slowly in his hands, reading the label with growing alarm. The contents were substances that Rice should never have been taking, medications that had no legitimate place in the old man's carefully monitored health regimen. Dr. Curry's eyes found Jones, who had been hovering in the doorway with an expression of appropriate grief and shock. But now, under the doctor's suddenly penetrating gaze, Jones felt his carefully constructed mask beginning to slip. The color drained from his face, his hands trembled visibly, and for the first time since the murder, genuine terror flickered in his eyes like a flame in a sudden wind. Curry saw it all, the guilt, the panic, the desperate calculation of a man whose perfect crime was unraveling before it had even been officially committed. The doctor's voice, when he finally spoke, was cold with certainty and barely contained outrage. The words fell like a judge's gavel, shattering the illusion of natural death that Jones and Patrick had constructed with such meticulous care. "I'm not signing this death certificate," Curry declared, his professional authority transforming into moral indignation. "Not until there's been a proper autopsy. This man did not die of natural causes." In that single moment, with those few decisive words, the perfect crime became an imperfect disaster. The conspiracy that Patrick and Jones had executed with such systematic precision began to collapse like a carefully balanced structure struck by an earthquake. The chloroform-soaked cloth that Jones had pressed over Rice's face had extinguished a life, but it had also ignited a scandal that would consume both conspirators and ensure that William Marsh Rice's story and his betrayal would be remembered long after their names had faded into criminal infamy. Jones opened his mouth to protest, to maintain the fiction of innocent grief, but no words came. He could see in Curry's eyes that the doctor knew, that the chemical evidence was irrefutable, that the web of lies was already unraveling with terrifying speed. The fortress that William Marsh Rice had spent a lifetime building had failed to protect him from the enemies within his own household. But in death, he would achieve a measure of justice that had eluded him in his final months of manipulation and isolation. Within 24 hours, police detectives would be swarming the Berkeley Hotel suite, examining every surface, every object, every inconsistency with the methodical precision of professional investigators. Within 48 hours, Albert Patrick's name would surface as detectives traced the forged checks and fraudulent documents back to their source, connecting the charming lawyer to the dead magnate in ways that defied innocent explanation. And within a week, the most sensational murder trial of the Gilded Age would begin to take shape, threatening to expose not just the intimate details of the crime itself, but the elaborate conspiracy to steal one of America's greatest fortunes and transform it from an educational legacy into the prize of murderers. The fortune that Patrick and Jones had killed to obtain would slip through their fingers like sand, and the university that was meant to be stolen would instead become a monument to Rice's vision, built on the very millions his murderers had tried to claim. The conspiracy had failed in its most crucial objective. It had created a mystery instead of a tragedy, and mysteries, as Albert Patrick would soon discover, demand solutions that neither charm nor legal expertise could provide. The autopsy confirmed Dr. Curry's suspicions with clinical finality. William Marsh Rice had been murdered by chloroform poisoning, his death the result of deliberate suffocation rather than the peaceful expiration of natural causes. The medical examiner's report detailed the chemical evidence with devastating precision: traces of chloroform in the lungs and throat, tissue damage consistent with forced inhalation, congested organs that spoke of a desperate struggle for breath, and levels of mercury in the bloodstream that suggested systematic poisoning over an extended period. But the investigation that followed this revelation unraveled the conspiracy with even greater swiftness, exposing not just a single act of murder, but an elaborate, months-long scheme to steal one of America's greatest fortunes through forgery, fraud, and ultimately homicide. What began as Dr. Curry's refusal to sign a death certificate became a criminal investigation that would captivate the nation and expose the darkest vulnerabilities of Gilded Age wealth. The New York Police Department descended upon the Berkeley Hotel with the methodical intensity of investigators who understood they were dealing with a crime of unprecedented magnitude. Detectives examined Suite 500 with forensic precision, cataloging every object, every document, every trace of the conspiracy that had operated within those walls for months. They found the chloroform-soaked cloth that had been carelessly left on the nightstand, the suspicious medicine bottles containing substances Rice should never have been taking, and most damningly, a cache of forged documents that revealed the true scope of the criminal enterprise. Bank records were subpoenaed, handwriting experts were consulted, and the entire paper trail of fraudulent checks and telegrams was reconstructed with painstaking attention to detail. Each piece of evidence pointed toward a conspiracy of staggering audacity, a plot to murder a millionaire and steal his fortune while his body was still warm. At the center of this unraveling web stood Charles Frederick Jones, the weak link in the conspiracy who proved to be exactly as fragile as his subordinate position suggested. Within days of the murder's discovery, Jones found himself seated in a harshly lit interrogation room, stripped of the invisibility that had been his greatest asset as a servant. Gone were the soft-footed rituals of service, the linen and silver and quiet deference that had defined his existence. In their place stood uniformed men with notebooks and unblinking eyes, men trained to notice hesitation and exploit fear. They confronted him with the overwhelming physical evidence: the chloroform bottle found in his possession, the forged documents bearing his employer's signature, the suspicious medicine that had no legitimate place in Rice's medical regimen. Jones cracked under police interrogation with the inevitable collapse of a man who had never been designed for criminal enterprise. Faced with the undeniable evidence and terrified by the prospect of facing the electric chair alone, his carefully constructed facade of loyal servitude disintegrated like wet paper. He confessed to everything with a torrent of desperate detail that only a guilty man could possess: the murder itself, executed with chloroform-soaked cloth pressed over his sleeping employer's face, the months of practicing Rice's distinctive signature until he could reproduce it with mechanical precision, the fraudulent telegrams sent to mislead the Houston lawyers who were growing suspicious, the mercury pills he had secretly administered to weaken the old man's constitution in preparation for the final act. But even in confession, Jones sought to preserve some fragment of his humanity by casting himself as a tool rather than an architect of evil. He insisted with desperate conviction that he had acted under Albert Patrick's orders and promises of wealth, that the charming lawyer had seduced him into conspiracy with visions of financial independence and social elevation that a lifetime of service could never provide. While Jones spilled his confession in a police station, Albert Thomas Patrick was arrested in his law office while brazenly attempting to assert control over Rice's estate, caught in the very act of trying to finalize the theft he had orchestrated murder to enable. Patrick's response was as predictable as it was theatrical. He met the accusations with aristocratic indignation that bordered on the sublime, denying everything with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to manipulating truth in courtrooms. The will was entirely legitimate, he insisted, the product of a secret friendship that had developed between himself and the reclusive magnate. The checks bearing Rice's forged signature were authorized payments for complex legal services rendered over months of dedicated counsel. Rice's death was tragically natural, the inevitable conclusion of an aged life, and any suggestion otherwise was the product of a servant's desperate attempt to deflect blame for his own criminal incompetence. But Patrick's denials, delivered with all the polished authority of legal training, could not withstand the avalanche of evidence assembled against him. Handwriting experts testified with scientific precision that the signatures on the fraudulent documents bore subtle but unmistakable differences from Rice's authentic hand, differences invisible to casual inspection but glaring under forensic analysis. The witnesses Patrick had recruited to validate the false will crumbled under cross-examination, admitting they had been bribed to swear to events they had never witnessed, their testimonies dissolving into contradictions under the relentless pressure of skilled prosecutors. Bank records revealed a damning pattern of forged checks that coincided precisely with Patrick's mounting gambling debts, creating a financial timeline that made his motives transparent. And most devastating of all was Jones's detailed, unflinching testimony, delivered with the desperate sincerity of a man trading his soul for a reduced sentence. The trial that commenced in early 1902 became a media sensation that gripped the nation with the force of a cultural phenomenon, dominating headlines from New York to San Francisco with an intensity that reflected the public's fascination with the fall of Gilded Age titans. Newspapers across the country devoted front pages to the proceedings, their headlines screaming variations of Texas millionaire murdered, and Butler confesses to chloroform killing. In typefaces designed to capture attention and sell papers, journalists dubbed it the crime of the century, a phrase that captured the public's morbid fascination with the spectacle of wealth, betrayal, and murder played out in a courtroom. The case possessed every element that Victorian audiences craved: immense wealth corrupted by greed, intimate betrayal within the sacred bonds of domestic service, a conspiracy that crossed rigid class boundaries, and the tantalizing spectacle of seeing the powerful reduced to common criminality. Crowds packed the courtroom daily, their numbers so great that police had to establish crowd control measures to prevent riots among those desperate for a glimpse of the proceedings. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with terrible theater as Albert Patrick, who had once commanded respect as a legal professional, now sat in the defendant's dock, his aristocratic bearing gradually eroding under the weight of testimony and evidence. The prosecution, led by some of New York's most skilled attorneys, proceeded with clinical detachment, methodically dismantling Patrick's denials with the precision of surgeons dissecting a corpse. They presented the forged documents, the bribed witnesses, the suspicious telegrams, and the damning pattern of financial fraud with systematic thoroughness that left no room for reasonable doubt. But the prosecution's most devastating weapon was Charles Jones himself, who took the witness stand and delivered testimony that destroyed whatever remained of Patrick's defense. Jones, granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, pointed an accusing finger at his former conspirator and narrated the entire plot in excruciating detail. He described the clandestine meetings where murder was planned with businesslike efficiency, the practice sessions where he learned to forge Rice's elegant signature, the mercury pills he had administered to weaken the old man's constitution, and finally, the terrible night when he had pressed the chloroform-soaked cloth over his employer's face and held it there until the breathing stopped forever. His testimony was damning not just in its content, but in its emotional authenticity. This was a man unburdening himself of guilt, seeking redemption through betrayal of the man who had led him into damnation. Patrick's attorneys attempted desperately to discredit Jones as a self-serving murderer whose testimony was purchased with the promise of leniency, but the physical evidence corroborated every element of his story with scientific precision. The jury, composed of men who understood the sanctity of trust and the horror of its violation, deliberated for less than a day before returning their verdict. On March 26, 1902, Albert Patrick was found guilty of first-degree murder, the premeditated killing of William Marsh Rice for financial gain. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, delivered a moral condemnation as severe as the legal penalty. Patrick would be executed in the electric chair, his life forfeit for the life he had taken and the fortune he had attempted to steal. The fates of the two conspirators diverged dramatically in the years that followed, illustrating the complex calculus of justice and mercy in the American legal system. Charles Jones, having purchased his survival through cooperation and confession, received a reduced sentence of 7 years in Sing Sing prison. He served his time in relative obscurity, a forgotten man in a forgotten cell, his name appearing in newspapers only occasionally as a footnote to the larger scandal. Upon his release in 1908, Jones vanished into the anonymity of American life, changing his name and disappearing into the vast population of the working class. He lived until the 1930s, dying in obscurity, forever haunted by the murder he had committed with his own hands and the betrayal he had performed in exchange for his freedom. Those who knew him in his later years reported a man who never spoke of his past, who flinched at unexpected sounds, and who seemed to carry a weight that no amount of time could lift. Albert Patrick's journey proved more complicated and, in its way, more ironic than simple execution would have provided. His death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in 1906 after a sustained campaign by sympathetic lawyers who argued that while Patrick was undoubtedly guilty of conspiracy and fraud, the actual act of murder had been committed by Jones. This legal distinction between the architect of a crime and its executor saved Patrick from the electric chair, but condemned him to decades behind bars. Yet even this was not the end of his story. In 1912, in a final twist of bitter irony that would have amused the calculating William Marsh Rice, Patrick was pardoned by Governor John Alden Dix after an intensive lobbying campaign by members of the legal community who argued he had been sufficiently punished for his crimes. Patrick emerged from prison at age 47, having spent over a decade behind bars, and lived until 1940, a long, diminished existence that served as its own form of punishment. He was never wealthy again, never powerful again, never respected again. He worked in obscurity, practicing law in the shadows of the profession that had once promised him everything, disbarred and disgraced, forever marked by the fortune he had tried to steal. His name was permanently associated with one of the era's most notorious crimes, and every newspaper obituary would lead with his conviction for murdering William Marsh Rice, reducing his entire existence to that single, terrible act of betrayal and violence. As for William Marsh Rice's fortune, the $7 million that had motivated murder and conspiracy, that had transformed loyal service into homicidal betrayal, it went exactly where the old magnate had intended, vindicating his vision even as it exposed his vulnerability. The fraudulent will was invalidated, the forged documents were set aside as criminal evidence, and Rice's authentic testament was probated and executed according to his original intentions. The legal battles that followed the murder eventually confirmed the validity of Rice's careful estate planning and the criminal nature of Patrick's elaborate deception. The millions that had been the object of such desperate greed were secured for the educational trust Rice had established with such meticulous care. The Rice Institute, which had nearly become the prize of murderers, instead became the monument Rice had envisioned, a temple of learning built upon the foundation of his accumulated wealth. Construction began on the Houston campus in 1910, funded by the very millions that Patrick had tried to steal through chloroform and conspiracy. On September 23, 1912, exactly 12 years after Rice's murder, the William Marsh Rice Institute for the Advancement of Literature, Science and Art opened its doors to its first students, transforming a dead man's wealth into living knowledge and fulfilling the vision that had consumed his final years. Today, Rice University stands as one of America's most prestigious institutions, educating thousands of students annually, producing groundbreaking research, and bearing the name of its murdered founder with pride and institutional memory. The campus, with its distinctive Mediterranean Revival architecture and manicured grounds, represents the triumph of Rice's vision over the conspiracy that sought to destroy it. Students walking across the quadrangle pass a bronze statue of William Marsh Rice, stern-faced and unsmiling, his legacy secured not despite his murder, but, in a strange way, because of it. The scandal ensured that his story would be remembered, that his university would be built with public attention and scrutiny, and that his name would be spoken with reverence rather than forgotten in the quiet dissolution of a naturally ended life. The empty Berkeley Hotel suite, forever marked as a crime scene in the public imagination, was eventually renovated and rented to new occupants who likely never knew that a millionaire had been murdered there with chloroform-soaked cloth in the small hours of a September morning. The hotel itself continued operating for decades before being demolished, its rooms and corridors erased from the physical landscape, but preserved in the historical record as the setting for one of the Gilded Age's most spectacular betrayals. But the story doesn't end with justice served or a university built, with conspirators punished or legacies preserved in marble and endowment. It ends instead with a haunting question that echoes through every gilded mansion and every carefully constructed fortune. A question that William Marsh Rice's murder poses to every generation that follows: can wealth ever truly protect us from those we trust most? The answer, written in chloroform and betrayal in a darkened room on Madison Avenue, suggests that the greatest fortunes in the world cannot purchase the one thing that matters most: the certainty that those closest to us, those who hold our keys and know our vulnerabilities, will not become the instruments of our destruction. Rice fortified his empire against markets and rivals, against storms and lawsuits, against strangers at the gates. But he could not fortify it against the enemy within, against the servant who pressed the cloth and the lawyer who provided it, against the terrible intimacy of betrayal that makes a mockery of every wall that wealth can build. William Marsh Rice spent his entire life constructing fortresses of wealth, fortresses of legal protection, fortresses designed to ensure his fortune would transcend mortality and create something eternal. From the humid swamps of early Houston to the granite canyons of Manhattan, he built walls against every conceivable threat: market panics, business rivals, grasping relatives, economic collapse. Each investment was calculated, each legal document crafted with meticulous precision, each decision designed to render him invulnerable to the chaos that destroyed lesser men. He believed, with the quiet fanaticism of the self-made, that if he structured his empire cleverly enough, it would outlive his mortal flesh and achieve the immortality that money promised to buy. He succeeded beyond his wildest ambitions. Rice University stands today as a living monument to his vision, sprawling across 300 acres of manicured grounds in the heart of Houston. Its distinctive Mediterranean Revival architecture, Romanesque arches, terracotta roofs, Byzantine details, creates a visual vocabulary of permanence and scholarly aspiration. More than 8,000 students walk its tree-lined paths annually, pursuing degrees funded by the endowment Rice died to protect. The university consistently ranks among the world's most elite institutions, producing Nobel laureates, pioneering researchers, and leaders across every field of human endeavor. His name is spoken daily in lecture halls and laboratories, carved in stone above doorways, cast in bronze on the statue that stands sentinel over the academic quadrangle. Rice's legacy has achieved the immortality he craved. His name will endure as long as civilization values learning and knowledge. But here lies the haunting irony that transforms his story from simple murder into profound cautionary tale. Rice fortified his empire against every external threat his calculating mind could imagine, yet he never conceived that the greatest danger would come from within his own sanctuary. He protected himself against hostile markets and legal challenges, against competitors who might bankrupt him, and relatives who might contest his will. He spent millions on lawyers to build paper walls around his assets, created Byzantine trust structures to survive every conceivable assault from the outside world. Yet in a failure of imagination that ultimately cost him his life, he never imagined the danger that slept in the room adjacent to his own. The fortress he built became his tomb. By isolating himself in the Berkeley Hotel, cutting himself off from the Houston advisors who might have protected him. He was not locking danger out. He was locking himself in with it. The walls erected for safety served only to muffle the sounds of his murder. This was not merely tactical error, but psychological blind spot born of his class and era. He trusted Charles Frederick Jones because Jones was invisible, the perfect servant who existed less as a human being than as animated furniture, a mechanism in the machinery of daily comfort. In the aristocratic calculus of the Gilded Age, servants were non-entities, incapable of the agency required to threaten titans of industry. Rice assumed his wealth inspired loyalty, or at least fear, in those dependent on him for livelihood. He never realized that the view from the bottom of the hierarchy reveals the master's frailty, his paranoia, his physical decay. Jones did not see a titan. He saw a trembling old man who needed help with his medicine and stood stubbornly between a servant and a life of leisure. He trusted Albert Patrick because Patrick was useful, a sophisticated lawyer who spoke the language of power and promised to navigate legal labyrinths. Rice mistook shared fluency in the grammar of wealth for shared values, never detecting the moral bankruptcy beneath Patrick's polished exterior. That trust extended to men who saw him not as a human being, but as a fortune to be plundered, became the weapon of his destruction. They did not see a master deserving respect. They saw a rotting vault of gold, a biological obstacle to their ambitions. The Gilded Age was an era obsessed with achieving immortality through accumulated wealth. The Vanderbilts, Carnegies, and Rockefellers believed that if they built high enough and strong enough, their names would endure forever, exempt from the oblivion that swallows the poor. And they were correct. Their names grace libraries, concert halls, universities. But immortality carved in stone cannot protect mortal flesh from those who hold the keys to your sanctuary. The great paradox of wealth is that it purchases isolation, and isolation breeds terrifying dependency. Every layer of protection Rice added required another human being to operate it, and every human being was a potential point of failure. The intimacy of service proved the ultimate vulnerability. The person who serves your breakfast knows your routines. The person who manages your schedule knows when you sleep. The person who holds your keys has access to your life when you are most defenseless. Rice fortified against external enemies, but left his jugular exposed to the barber's razor, his sleeping form vulnerable to the valet's cloth. Yet in death, Rice achieved what eluded him in life: true security. This is the final bitter paradox of his existence, the violence of his murder, and the sensational exposure of the conspiracy that followed, locked his fortune in place more securely than any legal document could have accomplished. The scandal galvanized his true defenders, invalidated fraudulent claims, and ensured every penny was directed exactly where he intended. His murder, meant to steal the university, instead became its foundation stone. The Rice Institute was built not just with his money, but on the ruins of the conspiracy that tried to destroy it. His name will outlive those who killed him by centuries. Albert Patrick is a footnote in criminal history. Charles Jones vanished into anonymity. But William Marsh Rice is a living presence, his name spoken with reverence by generations who never knew the horror of his final night. The university endures, his fortune serves its intended purpose, and his vision survived the conspiracy that killed him. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson written in the shadows of every great fortune, that no amount of wealth can protect you from the one threat you refuse to acknowledge, the danger that serves your breakfast, holds your keys, and knows exactly when you are most vulnerable. We build dynasties and fortify homes, believing we can control our narratives. But we are all at the mercy of those we admit to our private rooms, all vulnerable when we close our eyes. The story of William Marsh Rice is a Greek tragedy in Victorian dress, a reminder that while we can build institutions lasting 1,000 years, we cannot ensure our survival for a single night if we misplace our trust. His fortress failed the man but saved the dream. William Marsh Rice built a dynasty designed to outlive him. He succeeded. He simply didn't live long enough to see it flourish because he trusted the wrong people to help him get there. His university stands as a beacon of enlightenment, but its cornerstone will always be the dark silence of Suite 500, where a master learned too late that the most dangerous enemy is the one you hand the keys to your sanctuary.